So this is going to be a much more informal session, and it deals with one of the questions I get asked at every company or organization we do workshops, and almost at every talk is, how do we build an innovative culture? And it's become such a common concern and a common frustration that, working with my partners at Proteus International, we actually developed a tool to help self-assess and point the way to a more innovative culture. So I'll just explain it for a couple of minutes, and then we can have a discussion. One of the biggest blocking points or roadblocks to an innovative culture is actually Steve Jobs. Everybody thinks that that's what a great innovator looks like, and that you want to go out and you want to recruit these really mercurial, difficult people who are spouting off ideas all the time. And as it turns out, that's exactly what you don't want, is that type of personality. So if you, hopefully, well, you can see it up there, and hopefully most of you have the self-assessment in front of you by now. But there's really 5 things that you want to do to make teams innovative. The first is that you want to be constantly seeking out new problems. And one of the things I wanted to figure out when I was researching my book was, what makes great innovators different? What makes great innovative organizations different than most organizations? And I looked for similarities. You know, is there a particular organizational structure that seems to promote innovation, or is there some brainstorming technique? And I never found anything. What I found was that all of the companies, all of the different organizations, all of the people were very, very different. Some really great innovators were very soft-spoken and introverts. Some were extroverts. Some were in academia. Some were always in the private sector. But the one thing that they all had in common was that they were constantly seeking out new problems. And the most innovative organizations had built a very systematic and disciplined process for finding new problems. These also differed. For instance, Experian built something called data labs, where they go out to their customers and they try and find, as the guy who runs it, Eric, says, what's giving them agita. And usually when they find a good problem, they go back to the data labs, which is stocked with world-class data scientists, and they can come back with a prototype within 90 days. IBM, as I mentioned earlier this morning, has a tradition of grand challenges, and they're looking for problems that will take them years or even decades to solve, which you can do if you have a research division that has more Nobel Prize winners than most countries do. Google's 20% time is really like a human-powered search engine for new problems, because if somebody's 20% project ends up attracting a lot of people to work on it, they know it's probably a pretty important problem. What we like to do in workshops is a simple tool we call a PDO analysis, which is just basically, it's really a brainstorming exercise where you list the problems, disruptions, and opportunities that your organization is facing. And that really seems to surface good problems very, very well. But on a more basic level, you have to ask your teams, I mean, what are you doing to identify new problems? Not come up with some brilliant ideas, but what are you doing to constantly find new problems to solve? That's very difficult to do because most of us are pretty busy solving the problems we already have. But if you really want to be innovative, you always need to be looking for new problems to solve. The second thing is to create psychological safety. Google did a fantastic study on this that's been widely published. But when they were looking for what made their teams most innovative, what they found was it had little to do with the background or the structure of the teams. The most important thing was, did people feel safe enough and secure enough to voice new ideas without fear of rebuke? And the converse of that, if there's just a couple of people who are talking all the time, they tend to come up with much worse ideas. There's some other studies done out of MIT where they found a big, they could develop the biggest factor in whether teams were effective or not wasn't so much the substance of the discussion, but whether people spoke in roughly equal parts. And teams that speak in roughly equal parts tend to far, far outperform teams where one or two people dominate the discussion. Integrating work. It's very common in teams where you get a project and you start doling out different parts of the project to different people and then you pull it together at the end. A study at the CIA found, this was after 9/11, they wanted to see which intelligence teams were most effective. They found that the teams that actually integrated their work and solved problems together were far, far more effective than teams that worked in parallel. The fourth thing is to foster networks. How you connect and take insights from outside your team. What are you doing to make sure every member of your team is making connections? And the fifth is to be rigorous. Make sure you're checking your facts. Make sure you're challenging your own assumptions. There's a very good exercise from the Toyota production system. It's called the 5 Whys. If you want to find root causes or root problems, generally you have to call 5 Whys. The car broke down. Why the car break down? Well, because the engine seized up. Why the engine seized up? Well, the engine seized up. There wasn't any oil in it. Why wasn't there any oil in it? Well, because the car wasn't being serviced. So at the end of 5 Whys, you end up with a very much different problem and usually a much more solvable problem than you started out with. There's a nonprofit called 100K in 10 that has built a network to train 100,000 STEM teachers. And when they use this, they found that, for instance, one of the big problems with recruiting STEM teachers is people who study STEM subjects in college are actually discouraged by their professors from going into teaching at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. And so why are their professors discouraging them? Well, their professors discourage them because the administrators discourage them. Okay, why did the administrators discourage them? Well, the administrators discourage them because when people take teaching jobs, it scores bad on the US News and World Report rankings. Why does it score badly on the US News and World Report rankings? Well, because the census doesn't classify teaching as STEM jobs. Well, that's a far, far different problem than you started off with. And you'd approach it much, much differently. So applying that type of rigor is really very, very helpful. So I think that explains the self-assessment and the 5 points. So I'd like to just informally just kind of open up the discussion. Is anything unclear? Does anybody have any questions? This gentleman in the white sweater.
Let's say that you've got two teams that are within the same company but separated geographically. Thank you. You have two teams that are separated geographically, but they are on the same company. And they're supposed to be making identical products. And they can't quite agree on how the product should be made. They each have not invented here syndrome, and they want to do it their way, and they won't accept the other team's opinion. What do you do?
So there was a very interesting study, famous study done, I forget what the study was called, but it was done back in the 1950s. And they took these kids and they put them in summer camp. These were, I think, fairly lower income, middle to low income kids. And they got this free summer camp, and they were divided into two separate teams. And they were, and these two teams were competing. And it was a mess. They were all sabotaging each other, and they were fighting, and there was, almost like a war broke out. Even though they were racially the same, culturally the same, all from the same place, same family, similar family backgrounds, same religion, but they were really at loggerheads. And then they switched the experiment, where they started to give them common objectives. And they were able to see that exactly reverse. All of a sudden, when they were given the same objective and they had to work together, and this study was actually very manipulative. Like, for instance, they were going somewhere and they made the machine break down or something. So they had to work together to fix it. So when you have teams that are at loggerheads like that, you really have to ask, do they have the same objective? One thing I try and avoid, and another reason why that happens is sometimes because of the need for accountability, you tend to give perverse incentives. How are they compensated? Sometimes it's just prestige. They want their team to win. But you really need to start thinking about how do you make them see that common purpose and common objective, and that usually solves the problem.
Can you comment on the composition of the teams? Because you just mentioned about a team and they were all similar, and they still got at loggerheads. But at least my experience is, if the team is like very multidisciplinary, various cultures, half of it women, and if you have a team that is composed like that, at least my experience is it's a much stronger team, a much more dynamic team, and much better ideas come out of it. So I wanted to know what's your comment and experiences on that.
Well, first of all, you have to start with what problem you're trying to solve, right? One of my favorite stories I came across was a technology company. They were given a task, a contract to develop a computer chip that would detect pollutants at very small concentrations underwater. It's a very difficult job, so they put together a team of crack chip designers, and they were sitting there noodling over it for 45 minutes or so. And eventually, the marine biologist that was assigned to their team, he walks in with a bag of clams and drops it on the table. And they all sort of look up at him. He said, "You see, these clams, they can detect pollutants at just a few parts per million." And when that happens, their shells open. So we don't need a super sophisticated chip to detect pollution. We just need a very simple chip to detect when the clam shells open. So they saved like $1 million, and they apparently ate the clams for dinner. That's something a chip designer would never think of, but almost every marine biologist would know. On the other hand, if they were just trying to make the chip 20% more efficient, having a marine biologist dropping clams on the table wouldn't help at all. Matter of fact, it would very much get in the way. So you really need to focus on the type of problem to be solved. Generally speaking, and there's few things that are, that study after study, decade after decade, are all in agreement about. But diversity of diverse teams perform massively better than even more objectively qualified homogeneous teams. But there's also a problem. Teams that are more multidisciplinary, more diverse, they don't feel like they're doing as well. So, imagine one team where everybody's got different backgrounds, different ideas, everybody's questioning each other. It doesn't seem like they're getting anywhere. Another team, everybody looks at things the same way. They're all going in the same direction. They feel like they're really making progress. They're really moving fast. Unfortunately, they're moving in the wrong direction. So that's where psychological safety comes in. That's where building the culture of people who are supportive, we've all been in work environments like this where you gain points for making somebody else look stupid. In my company in Ukraine, on the very first day of training, we gave them a set of principles. One was always help, that if someone comes to you for help, it's your job to help them. You can't say it's not my job, that is your first job, right? But another thing we said was that, and this was written down, told to them, explained to them, that we fire nasty people. You will get fired faster than anything else. Faster than underperformance or staying late, going and drinking late at night and not coming in the morning. Nothing will get you faster than being nasty. And that's a huge part of it. What your culture rewards and what it punishes. If you're rewarding people for being nasty and undermining people and trying to make other people look stupid or bad or lazy or whatever, that's the kind of behavior you're going to get. So as senior leadership, you have to make it really, really super clear that not only will that behavior not be rewarded, but it's going to be punished and punished harshly. I mean, that sounds a little mean, but it's pretty much what you have to do. Yes?
Just going back to your comment about diverse teams doing better than homogeneous teams, there was an MIT study, I don't know if you were aware of it, just a couple years ago, they took kids, put them together, and they had this result where the number of ideas expanded the number of good ideas. So the homogeneous group, even though the teams were similar in their makeup, but the thinking process of the homogeneous team with the latest tools and cutting edge capabilities, working long hours on just one focused idea, was nowhere near the optimal solution that this sort of ragtag team that had many, many, many brainstorming alternatives and then, collaboratively, I guess at some point, you have to down select to a solution. But it was interesting that what they identified is optimal solutions come from many solution ideas, whereas suboptimal solutions come from focusing on only a few ideas.
Yeah, there's sort of two parts to that. One is the diversity of people, but also just creativity studies for, again, decades, and historical studies of, people like Mozart and Picasso. They found that the more ideas, the better ideas. Not only the more ideas, but the percentage of good ideas increases the more ideas you have. And when you look and you see people's most active periods, or even different people, the one with more ideas has more good ideas. That's why I write every day, right? And then, yeah, the more diverse people will give you more diverse ideas. But so important is that they're testing each other's assumptions. And that's the sort of double-edged sword, because questioning each other's assumptions is really, really, really important. But it's a fine line between questioning assumptions and attacking people. And that's what you really have to watch out for. Yeah? Oh, my friend from Purdue.
So Jan Anders Monson, you have probably purposely avoided this, and that is the most trivial of all driving forces, is financial reward. Is financial reward important? I see difference between Asia and Europe, how they use financial reward for innovation. Or it's better to have some freedom coming with the innovation, we say excellence to the people, or where does it come in on the individual person's level?
Generally speaking, and again, there's studies going back years about this, money tends to be a very bad motivator. In my personal experience, and I came up through sales, so I was running sales teams. Money can create some very, very perverse incentives. And a lot of sales managers, they end up having crazy, these sort of Rube Goldberg type incentive systems, which are exactly supposed to. My experience is money often incentivizes people to give the appearance of performance rather than performance itself. Obviously, financial rewards have to be part of it, right? Nobody wants to feel like they're unappreciated. People generally don't innovate if they're not. It's hard to innovate when you're not financially secure, So the financial rewards have to be there, but you definitely don't want to be micromanaging them. That's why even with sales teams, I always had bonuses tied to group performance. Once you start giving people rewards for individual performance, you end up, especially in sales, basically, you end up. I'll tell you a funny story about. I did consulting and I did turnarounds for a while, and in almost every single turnaround I did, I almost always fired the sales director, because, and it was so often, it happens so often, the same process. So imagine you start a company, you start with 4 salespeople, right? You split up the accounts by sector, or maybe, I don't know, A to Z, or however you do it. So things go well for a while, the company's growing, and then when the salespeople leave, right? So, okay, one salespeople leaves, you go hire new salespeople. What happens to those accounts? Well, they get divvied up among the 3 existing salespeople, and the new one who comes gets all the, non-performing accounts. And you go through this through a couple of different cycles, and all of a sudden you have one person who was made the sales director, who has all the good accounts, and everybody else is like fighting for scraps. Objectively, their performance is great. One of the companies I had a turnaround project on, the sales manager was responsible for 90% of the budget. 90% of the sales coming from this one woman. Because she had hogged all the accounts. Once I fired her, sales went up. Because those accounts were actually not performing as well as they could have, because this one woman was hogging them all. So those are the kind of things you need to watch out for when it comes to financial performance, especially in the situation this gentleman was talking about. If you have your financial incentives for two different teams, sort of competing, well, one team's going to try and undermine the other team. Besides just the sort of tribal way of one team wants to beat another team for prestige. You add money into there, and you're really going to get some vicious behavior.
Okay, this is the last question we have. Yes.
All right, a lot of pressure here. So I've been on a lot of...
Don't worry, it's a safe space.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to ask you about, actually. I've been most of my career working on technical problems, so when I look down the list, the areas of finding a problem that's really clearly defined, that's often not, rarely been a problem. Integrating has always been a necessity because none of us were capable of solving it alone because they're so complex. And the networks, we reached out for information, and being rigorous was part of how we did science and engineering. But the one thing that has constantly been a problem in my career is creating a safe environment, creating an environment where, and a lot of it comes down to money, but not necessarily what pay, but budget control. So you're often on these projects, and you're the driver, the innovator, the energy to execute, but you have no budget control. And the person who has the budget control is often one that you have to explain to multiple times why you're doing certain things, because they're not necessarily technical, they're business. And I'm wondering, around budgeting, any strategies? I would say one environment was that we were unbelievably powerful and creative for a period of years is when budget control was moved right down to us. We had our own budgets, we were responsible for the money we spent, and we had to report back on how we used it, instead of constantly begging for money where there was some competition against other projects that you had no understanding about, you don't know why you're being turned down. So I'm wondering around that and other things that create a safe environment.
Obviously, giving control of budget is one way to do it. Another way to do it is with transparency. In that type of situation where you're trying to push for resources, and it doesn't have to be money, it could be time or whatever it is, other resources, and they're going to somebody else. You don't know why, and you're angry about it. And think about why that is, though, especially with budget with the manager or an administrator or something. What you're really talking about is a lack of shared purpose. And when you have this lack of shared purpose, you find that people are at loggerheads. There's a great book about this, actually, by General Stanley McChrystal called Team of Teams. And he had that same problem in Iraq, where they were killing terrorists, they were doing their jobs, but more would spring up. And he found that the Navy SEALs didn't work well with the Army Rangers and stuff. But by creating a shared purpose and a shared consciousness, they were able to turn that around, and it became a big part of the success. Then he mouthed off to Rolling Stone, got fired, and runs a big business consultancy that trains companies how to do this. So, so I think we're good for lunch now. I'll be around if anybody wants to talk to me later. Thank you very much.